Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. So, in today's video, as the title suggests, I am going to be interviewing someone who recently got their PhD arguing for evolutionary creationism or theistic evolution, whatever term you would like to use. But before we get into that, I want to make a couple of announcements. So, I am working on the script and the research for my next video in the biblical slavery series, which is going to be talking about the slave laws in the Mosaic Law specifically. Um, I am also working on a script for a video on the flood because I think part of the young earth creationist model is to have a global flood event, particularly at least in modern young earth creationism, as it helps explain their understandings of the world and how the world came to be the way it is today. Um, and I think we're good aside from that. So let me go ahead and bring on my guest. Hey, how you doing today, Dr. Hart?
Really good. Thank you for calling me Dr. Hard. That's still sinking in.
Yeah. No, yeah, I can't wait. I'm hoping one day to get my PhD as well in a field. That'd be really cool.
Awesome.
But yeah, so tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah. So my name is Seth Hart. I am a professor of theology at Ozark Christian College. And as you mentioned, I recently passed my Viva with no corrections on a topic of evolutionary creationism and areas around that, dealing in the philosophy of biology. I don't think I technically have my doctorate until they hand me the diploma, but that's basically like a sign off, right? So, yeah, that's a little bit about me. I've published a bit in the area. You can look me up, especially in the journal Theology and Science, if you're curious about some of my work.
Yeah, so we have a lot to get to. So let's go ahead and dive right in.
Oh, I should also
Oh, go
mention
ahead.
I'm the host of Spiritually Incorrect. My co host would
Yes.
murder me if I didn't mention that. So, spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com.
Yes, the link to that is in the description. Definitely check it out. They have interviewed young Earth creationists, people on other sides of that debate. They interviewed Dr. Ryan Mullins to talk about God and emotion, which is an episode I particularly enjoyed. Not all the people you interview are Christians as well,
No.
right? Like some of them talk about like other spiritual things that aren't
Our
Christian particularly.
next episode is with a Satanist, a chaplain in the Church of
Oh,
Satan. Mhm.
that's I will tune in for that. Like,
Comes
no,
out
because
Tuesday.
no, that's epic. Because like one of the friends I had for the longest time was actually a Satanist
Wow.
before she had converted to Christianity. So that's been an interest of mine as well. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Firstly, what the heck is evolutionary creationism or theistic evolution in the first place?
Yeah, so you use the 2 terms interchangeably, which is controversial. Some people
Oh,
think they do mean the same thing, other people do not. Because traditionally, the idea that Christianity or Judaism or Islam, the theistic faiths, are compatible with evolution were generally and broadly called theistic evolution. Obviously, theism and evolution, and finding some sort of model of putting these together, especially because of the revelation in Genesis and also in the Quran that seem to suggest a possible incompatibility between them. Now, more recently, because of pushback from creationists, there has been an attempt to sort of rebrand basically what theistic evolution is. So then the term evolutionary creationism began to be pushed out as a model that's different from theistic evolution in the sense that whereas theistic evolutionary models quite often were sort of portrayed, this is again broad generalizations, as seeing God as a bit more distant and sort of allowing evolution to run, maybe interfering and tinkering with it a bit. Evolutionary creationists, well, first off, the term itself, it includes creationism in it. They are affirming that God is the creator in a very sort of classical Christian understanding of what the doctrine of creation affirms, which isn't incompatible with evolution. That surprises a lot of people that for most of Christian history, evolution was not considered as in conflict with the doctrine of creation, but we can get into that. So they called it evolutionary creationism, but they also wanted to rebrand it because they wanted to emphasize a bit more of an active role of God in the evolutionary process. Now, if that sounds like a very vague barrier, like boundary between evolutionary creationism and theistic evolution, that's because it is. And which is why it's controversial. Are these just 2 terms for the same thing, or are they actually denoting something different? Well, who knows, right? These terms are what we make them. So I call myself an evolutionary creationist because I do like the emphasis on the fact that creation is should not be seen as in competition to evolution. When we think of how God creates, we often think about him using secondary causes, using forces of creation for what he does. Classic example is when God parted the Red Sea. It says a wind came. A great wind came and split the Red Sea. Now, could God have done that without the wind? Sure. God
Mhm.
doesn't need the wind to do that. But did God use the wind? Did God use a natural force to do a miracle? Yes. And we still say God did that. That is a direct, miraculous action of God, even though there's this natural explanation for it. A very odd and, once in a universe explanation. This will never happen ever again. But nevertheless, there were natural forces involved. And so I think that when we think about how God interacts with creation, we need to have a more biblical model of it and see that if God uses what are called secondary causes, which is a way of saying agents, part of creation is basically God's God's toolkit for how he acts in the world. That's actually a biblical model of how God operates in the world. Even in the creation account, it says, and God said this, and the earth brought forth. So there's the idea of God commanding creation and creation actively responding to the command of God. That's even in the Genesis account itself. And so that's why I like that term evolutionary creationism. So I can go longer. I've probably already gone too long. Go ahead.
No, that's good. That's good. So in your view, because I've heard different views, I've heard naturalistic versus supernatural evolution. I've heard some people say that what does it even mean to speak of something as natural if if reality consists within God and
Yeah.
God allows all things to be. So I guess I would ask you, what is your opinion on how involved God is in evolution before we get to the next question?
Yes, this gets into a very complicated issue. First off, I would say that I do not believe in the natural supernatural divide. Now, that makes a lot of people suspicious because then it's like, are you collapsing creator and creature together, God and the world together? And the answer is no, because the natural supernatural divide is actually quite modern. There's actually a Catholic theologian named Henri de Lubac who wrote a book that's currently being translated called So Natural, who he basically outlines where this view came from. It wasn't a view that goes back very far in the Christian tradition. It's actually quite modern. And it was a way of basically seeing the world as two-tiered. The supernatural world of angels and gods and demons up here, and the natural world down here. And there's a sort of this self-enclosed, maybe God can sort of reach in and tinker with things, or angels can reach in and tinker with things. But it's very dualistic. Now, that's not how the ancients conceived of the world, because they would talk about the nature of angels.
Mm,
They would talk about the nature of angels. And even today, we talk about the nature of God. And that's not a coincidence. The word natural is the same sort of word. To talk about natural is to talk about just the nature of something. And when you begin to parse what makes something supernatural versus what makes something natural, if you go into philosophical circles, and I won't belabor this point, it gets really tricky. It becomes really, really tough to really draw a fine line of what counts as natural and what counts as supernatural. So, without belaboring that point, I just wanted to point out that the difficulty of even saying that. Now, where do I see God interacting? Well, in my dissertation, what I do argue is that I see evolution itself as teleological. Now, when people hear teleology, they commonly hear design, but I don't mean that. To say something is teleological just means that it has a goal, a purpose, an end, some sort of end state towards which it's in some way pointed. And this is where it's natural motion, it's natural movement, the change within it is in some way directed towards it. So for instance, I can say, if I get up and I'm getting myself a cup of coffee, and I ask what's the explanation? If someone asks what's the explanation of me doing that? Well, you could say, well, his neurons are firing and his muscles are contracting and blah 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 blah. That would be an explanation via the efficient cause, the sort of things that are hitting together causing me to do that. But that's not, if you're asking me that, that's probably asking about that. You're probably not asking about what's causing me to move that way. If you say, what's the explanation of Seth getting a cup of coffee? You might say, because he's thirsty, or because he needs caffeine, or because he's addicted and desperately needs to get away from Starbucks.
mm.
Well, outside of that last one, right? The first two, because I'm thirsty or because I need caffeine, those are a teleological explanation. You're pointing to the end. And that is what explains everything else. It explains the neuron firing. Because I want a cup of coffee, because there's a
Mm,
desire, a need for it, explains why my neurons are firing. It explains why my muscles are contracting, why I'm moving across and doing these sorts of actions that I'm doing. So, Thomas Aquinas, a great theologian, would call teleology, he said it was the cause of causes. And what he meant by that is when there is an end or goal present, it explains all the other causes, it explains the efficient cause, it explains everything else leading up to it. My want for a cup of coffee explains every other cause, the muscles
mm,
contracting and the neurons firing, right? Without that desire or goal, none of the other causes happen. None of the efficient causes happen. I think the same thing is true of evolution. I think it's perfectly possible to give an explanation of evolution only by the efficient cause of looking at certain mutations, looking at certain species dying off. But again, just like with the coffee cup illustration, that wouldn't be a full explanation. And it's because of the nature of natural selection itself. And it would probably take quite a bit of time to explain it. But what I particularly focus on is the concept of biological fitness, which, if you read the philosophy of biology literature, it's next to impossible to define what fitness is. And if you've heard this phrase, survival of the fittest, well,
mhm.
you know that how central that is to the Darwinian paradigm. Richard Lewontin, who's one of the most famous biologists of the past century, says it's one of the three parts of natural selection that if you don't have it, it just doesn't work. You don't have it as an explanation. But the problem is we don't know what fitness is. It's become next to impossible. Well, I do solve that in my thesis. To be so bold, I think I solve that, but it's only because I say that fitness is a teleological concept. And not only that,
Mm,
I also say Darwin himself admitted this. And this was an
gotcha.
open secret in the 1800s that this was a teleological concept. And so, because of that, you then begin to ask, where do ends and purposes come from? Well, they're not physical properties. It's not as if by dissecting an atom I can find a purpose. You can't dissect my brain even and find a purpose. Purposes are mental properties. So if there are real natural purposes in the world, you have to invoke a mind. Well, it's easy enough for my coffee illustration. It's my mind that wants the coffee. It's easy enough to say, like, a cheetah is hunting a gazelle. What's causing that? Well, it's his desire to eat the gazelle. But what happens whenever it's natural selection, this giant process itself? Natural selection isn't a mind. There's no mind there. So, to even make sense of natural selection itself, we're introducing mental properties. That's a problem unless you're a theist. Now, that's a
Gotcha.
lot. That is a lot, but I
Yeah.
just wanted to now, and that barely covers the surface of it, but that is how I see God interacting.
Gotcha. Okay. No, that's really interesting because I was, as far as I was aware, the only options were like he's not tinkering or he is tinkering. But yeah, if you have a, it sounds like at least you have a teleological end, then you don't need to posit him tinkering in order to posit his involvement.
No, and that's the
Yeah.
thing, right? You're not invoking God to sort of fill in. It's the God is sort of actively, the cause of mutagenesis, of creating mutations and stuff like that. That's a lot of times been the explanation. But I think that we're still thinking as functional mechanists or nearly functional atheists at that point, in the sense that we only see God or the universe operating on sort of blind natural forces rather than on teleology, mental properties, which, if you're a theist, you should think the world is just suffused with these.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So as brief as you can, you actually have you you
That's a
you
challenge for me.
yeah, I know. You did a video with I forget the guy's name, but check out the YouTube channel What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. You did a video with him talking about the history of evolution and evolutionary thought amongst Christians and theists and Darwin in the 1800s. So I would check that out for a more detailed discussion. But here,
Yes,
could you give us a history of evolutionary creationism and
and I
help
will
us
do this brief.
yeah, and give us a understanding of the diversity of belief within evolutionary theology, you could say.
Yeah, there's a wide variety. That might take a while. What I will do is give a brief description. So when
Mhm.
Darwin first posited the theory of natural selection, along with Wallace, these are considered the co-discoverers. Now, Darwin was probably still a theist. It seems like he was still a theist at the time. Now, what's really interesting to me, and I talk about it more there, is a guy named David Livingston, not the missionary. There's actually a modern scholar who is a historian who outlines this. He wrote a book called Darwin's Forgotten Defenders. And what he does is he outlines the fact that early on, Darwin's greatest defenders were quite often evangelical Christians.
Mm.
They were evangelical Christians, which is just nuts to me. I
Yeah.
just it's just absolutely nuts to me because that's not the history you hear. You hear the church opposing it, but then you actually look at Asa Gray, who introduced Darwin's book to America. He was a botanist at Harvard, and he was a firm evangelical Christian.
Mm.
And so, and you can go check out those resources. But originally, there wasn't this idea of Darwinism as being sort of uniquely against the Christian faith or even evangelical faith. In fact, there was other Darwinian models that quite often Christians had a harder time with. Now, fast forward a bit, and then once you get into about the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, and on and on and on, there began to be a major shift in Darwinism, which became known as the modern synthesis. And come around 1959, the 100-year anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species, you begin to see a lot of works come out where natural selection and the modern synthesis were portrayed as anti-teleological and in some sense incompatible with evolution. Now, it's not coincidental that right at that time is whenever the book The Genesis Flood was published and the beginnings of creation science came out. Because the antagonism between Christianity, conservative Christianity, and natural selection, Darwinism, really took off around that time, late 50s, early 60s. There was some precedent before then. People think of the Scopes trial, but mostly those objections were moral objections. They weren't scientific objections. The idea that, yes, this is incompatible with a young earth literal reading, 6-day creationism emerged in the 60s. Now, as for different models, there's been different models throughout history. Some are quite conservative and see God very active in the process. I see God as always active in the process. And this goes all the way back to the 1800s, a guy called Aubrey Moore. This is a view that basically puts evolution in conversation with prior theologians like Thomas Aquinas, who have brought up already, and the very sort of traditional models of theology and God's relationship to the world. There's been much more liberal models, which tend more towards process theology and seeing God as very hands off. And usually the idea of God is giving freedom to creation to do whatever it wants. So it sees God as, at most, a sort of divine lure, drawing creation towards itself, but not omnicausal, we might put.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's I believe her name is Dr. Solaretter.
Yeah, good friend of mine.
Yeah, she seems to hold the view that creation is w- God allows creation to be relatively free to create itself,
Yes.
it seems.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, she's leans a bit more toward the model of creation being allowed to sort of self-create. She's an
Mhm.
open theist as well. So God doesn't know the future. God is just
Oh,
yes, yeah.
okay,
So she is an open theist. So
gotcha.
God is just there. It's called this relational theology. It's open and relational theology. She's part of this movement led by Thomas Ord. Um, yeah, so she's definitely part of that. If you'd like to see an interaction between my work and hers, the journal Theology and Science, I have an article called "An Evolving Theodicy" where I actually interact with her work.
Oh, okay, that's
Mhm.
interesting. No, I didn't know she was an open theist. I was in here like, yeah, these creatures could be free and God can be omniscient, but I wonder if she finds a contradiction between those two things.
If
I'm
creatures are
curious.
free, and what else? I'm sorry. And
If
God.
creatures are free to create and God is omniscient.
Yeah, I'm not sure what she would say particularly to that. I wouldn't want to
Yeah,
speculate, but she does. She for especially for theodicy reasons, which is what she does is evolutionary theodicy. I think she prefers open theism as a solution.
gotcha. Interesting. Okay. So it seems obviously in order for theistic evolution to be true, God needs to exist and evolution needs to be true,
Yeah,
right? That's like the baseline.
yeah,
So starting with evolution, what evidence do we have for evolution? Because I mean,
lots.
on both of these, I can't tell you how many times I've been told there's no evidence for evolution or there's no evidence for God, or more specifically, which we'll get to in just a second, there's no evidence for microevolution.
You mean
Uh,
macro?
Or excuse me, yeah, macro. So yeah, talk to us about the evidence for evolution.
Yeah, so the people who say so whenever you say there's no evidence for evolution, normally what's meant by that is they take what's called a presuppositionalist approach to apologetics, which means that all evidence is model dependent. Now, I think that I'm not going to trash that approach. I think there's some merits to it, but at the same time, I don't think I do think that there is a way of measuring evidence, like the facts themselves, against different models and determining which one these facts privilege over the other one. So you hear young Earth creationists do this, but I don't think it works because the evidence for evolution that are easier to comport for with an evolutionary model over a sort of young Earth creationist model, it's overwhelming because you have things that the evolutionary model would predict. So, for instance, the molecular and genetic evidence in non-coding parts of the genome, you have a bunch of what are called neutral mutations, mutations that like you swap out you swap out parts of it and it doesn't really affect the organism. So it'll pass that on to its offspring and they'll pass that on to its offspring. And eventually it'll spread through the population because it doesn't hurt the organism. It doesn't help the organism. It's neutral. It's fitness neutral. And what you begin to see is okay, well, if evolution is true and we all descended from common ancestors, we can begin to trace these back and notice these neutral mutations. There'll be more common neutral mutations between me and a chimpanzee than there will be between me and a goldfish because we shared a closer family tree, right? We would share that from our common ancestor who had that particular neutral mutation. And lo and behold, that's exactly what you find. Across the board, you find this.
So the evidence fits the model.
The evidence fits the model. More to the point, this is something I've never been satisfied with young Earth models on this. And that is how do you explain the obvious secession of the fossil record? What you'll see young Earth creationists do is they'll try to undermine particular instances of fossil evidence. So, for instance, Archaeopteryx with the dinosaur bird relationship, or Tiktaalik with the land fish, like fish going onto land. And they'll argue particular things, right? But whenever you step back and look at the entire trajectory, why is it that Archaeopteryx exists? Why exactly at the point in the fossil record where it was predicted that you would expect a dinosaur bird transition fossil, you find one? You find
Mm,
one with all the features you'd expect. And let's say, well, there are modern birds that have claws and modern birds that have teeth and bones in their tail. Yes, but not all three at once.
mm,
Not all three at once. And that's why is there such an odd bird right there exactly in the fossil record? Just Noah's flood just happened to put it there. And God in his providence do that just to make it a little bit harder for us to have faith. Now, I
mm.
don't think that's the case, you know? I think we can look at this testimony. We can see that when we look back hundreds of millions of years ago, right when we expect fish to be developing organisms to go onto land, we find Acanthostega and we find Tiktaalik. And so the fossil record, just if you take a step back and look at it, it's far more compatible with an evolutionary model. Yeah, well, you can pick out little instances that might be problematic, but get the big picture in mind. And I could keep going on and on, but I think to me, those are the two big ones: the genetic evidence and the fossil record. I mean, we could talk about biodiversity as well. Why is it that marsupials are found in the Americas and Australia? Well, that's weird. If you're creationist, you could say, well, that's where God put them, right? God put them in these locations, and that explains it. But if you're an evolutionist, you'd have to say, no, they had to travel by some land bridge. And so there was a prediction that they would find marsupial bones in Antarctica, crossing from back when they were connected, Antarctica to the tip of South America, or they'd find it through Asia going across the land bridge. And lo and behold, that's exactly what they found, right?
Mhm.
So again, it's just prediction after prediction after prediction that I think that when if you're going to elevate science as as a method for determining truth, then you can't just wave away these instances, especially when they repeat so often.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things was that there was I believe, a creationist publishing journal that, excuse me, that published something from a non young Earth creationist talking about uh, basically the flood and the whether or not the ground would be like mud and things like that. So it was talking about like sedimentary rock and
Mhm.
its relation to the flood geology, and it was like your account of the flood and how that affects the natural world does not account for what we know about sedimentary rocks and mud and things like that. And he basically said effectively that even thousands of years later, with how much water is supposed to be involved in the flood, Jesus would have been walking on mud everywhere
Yeah.
because it still would not have the time necessary to return back to uh it's the way that we think of, dirt and soil and stuff like that.
Yeah. There's a lot of problems. And for
Yeah.
instance, what do you do with the fact I might avoid that question. What do you do with the fact that, plate tectonics has occurred? Very obviously, it has occurred. Well, normally, if you don't have another solution, young Earth creationists will put it during the flood. They'll put it during the flood. But if you have these continental drift moving at that rate, you're talking thousands of miles in the space of a year. What you're going to do is generate so much heat, you would cook the arc. You would boil
Yeah.
the ocean.
Yeah.
And so again, there is no model currently on offer, and I think I've talked to a few young Earth creationists to admit this. There's no model right now that can explain all the evidence. And another
Mm.
thing is, what do you do with the fact this is more old Earth rather than evolution? But what do you do with the fact that other planets like the moon very much bear the marks of millions, if not billions of years of celestial impacts, of objects running into it, of impacts. Again, they say perhaps I've read this that perhaps this happened during the flood, that God bombarded the moon with a bunch of meteors to leave all these things. And this is true across all different celestial bodies. And again, it's
But
like,
why though?
yeah, it's
But
very
why
odd.
though?
It's a very odd explanation that,
Mm.
over the course of a year that hundreds of thousands of meteor impacts would be hitting the moon, right? And not destroying it and all these sorts of things and other celestial bodies as well. Where did they come from? All this sort of stuff. It's what's called ad hoc explanations. Now, you can always make your model fit if you continue to add assumption after assumption after assumption. In philosophy of science, there's a joke. It's called epicycle after epicycle because there was an attempt to preserve the geocentric model by continuously making it more complex to always fit this new data that actually showed the sun at the center of the solar system. But it
Mm.
got so complex one day that someone finally, eventually, over time, people are just like, why don't we just go with the simpler model that the sun's at the center? It's just so much simpler and way less ad hoc. We're just trying to preserve this based on tradition. And I see the young Earth creationists doing the exact same thing. They continually add epicycle after epicycle. Oh, the moon, it bears the marks of all these meteors. Well, maybe God threw a bunch of meteors at it at some point, and
Yeah.
other celestial bodies. You continue to add these assumptions and assumptions which fit with an older universe, but do not fit with a young Earth model. And so, if you're going to use science as a paradigm for truth, then go all the way. And I feel like young Earth creationists do this halfway.
Gotcha, gotcha. So, on the note of evidence for evolution, I keep being told this. Even when I wrote I wrote an article on this and showed evidence of evolution, even cited part of a work that talks about this particular species of plankton having three taxonomic diversifications, and I think it was two mass extinction events, and as evidence for micro or macro evolution, excuse me. And people still said that was microevolution because the plankton isn't becoming a fish or something like that.
Yeah.
So talk to us about the difference between micro and macro evolution and the evidence for macro.
Yeah. So, gosh. So the term micro and macro evolution. So the term micro macro evolution actually comes from George Gaylord Simpson, who was one of the architects of the modern synthesis of evolutionary theory. And what's interesting to me is he meant microevolution as evolution within a species. It's basically what the population geneticists that the field that he was basically creating, one of the architects in creating, what they were doing. They were measuring genetic changes, allele frequency within a population over time. Macroevolution is basically what he says. Well, that's the stuff that we measure in fossil records. You know, one species becoming another, becoming another. So, microevolution changes within a species. Macro changes between species.
For a quick analogy to that, I've heard even people who teach biology say that the difference between micro and macro is equivalent to inches and feet,
Yeah,
essentially.
that would be yeah, that might be a good analogy. Um,
Gotcha. Okay.
but what's interesting to me is that both young Earth creationists, at least of the Kinham anthropogenesis variety, which I'm going to take as sort of standard, and evolutionary science, both believe in macroevolution
Hmm.
because Kinham does not believe that there was a polar bear, a brown bear, a black bear, a panda bear, all on the ark. He thinks there was only one original bear kind. Baramin is usually the term that he uses. This kind, this Hebrew word, and that this diversified, it speciated is the term into the different bear species. That's macroevolution. That's one species becoming another species.
Yeah, no, I there was a atheist that talked about this double speak because a lot of
Mhm.
people won't systematize a definition of the word kind.
Yeah,
So they'll say you're not showing evidence that one kind is turning into another, but then when um but then they don't define the term kind.
yeah,
So they'll admit that like wolves are probably the ancestors of dogs,
right.
but they won't call that speciation. They won't call that a different species,
Mhm.
even though at least according to the biological species concept, they are, right? I don't think the two can produce viable offspring, or am I wrong
Well,
there?
well, that's the biggest problem. There's multiple definitions of what a biological species is. The
Yeah.
one that's most common, Ernst Mayer's, where they can interbreed essentially. They can create viable offspring. Well, that only works for a tiny portion of critters on the planet because most species are actually asexual. Bacteria, they don't
Yeah.
reproduce sexually, so that doesn't make sense to use that. So it's actually only a very so that's not a very good definition of species, and that biologists always recognize that. So I mean, but we need a concept of species just to be able to talk about the difference between a wolf and a giraffe, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, like this is where you can get some double speak and some weird stuff going on, right? But I mean, everyone agrees that a black bear is different from a brown bear and a grizzly bear. And yet both Kinham and Richard Dawkins believe that that derived from a more archetypal bear. And so using the term, I always tell even young earth creationists, I say, hey, just avoid this language. I think it's creating more confusion. I actually think I'm not trying to undermine you or saying I think your ministry would be better if we avoided this language because I think it creates
Mm,
so much confusion. There's because that's not why George Gaylord Simpson invented these terms. He was trying to differentiate what the population geneticist does from what say the paleontologist does. And so the evidence that I gave you from genetics from the fossil record, that is macroevolution. And it's not just macroevolution that goes beyond what someone who believes in baraminology, who believes in, distinct kinds, believes is possible. The best argument I've ever heard that evolution has a limit, so to speak, which is what creationists are trying to say and intelligent design theorists are trying to say when they say make this distinction between micro and macro evolution. The best argument I've ever heard actually comes from Michael Behe in his book The Edge of Evolution. He avoids this terminology altogether quite wisely. And he just says there's an edge. We don't know where it is. It's going to differ between different species but there is a sort of sharp boundary for how much evolution and natural selection can account for. The rest we need another mechanism for. And that's where he throws in intelligent design as an explanation. That I think is a healthier way of seeing it. And that's where I think the argument should be. But at the same time, if you look at the fossil record, if you look at this genetic evidence, if you look at some of these things that evolution explains via biodiversity, evolution explains a far greater amount of this quite naturally. Doesn't need these ad hoc conjuncts is what they're called. These extra things added in. Well, maybe God did this, maybe God did this, and that will explain it. It doesn't need that stuff. And thus it becomes a much simpler, better explanation of the biological data.
gotcha. Okay. And so, of course, again, in order for this to be true, God has to exist, right?
Yes, well,
So
yeah, of course.
so we're gonna assume that, but I've gotten both, I mean, ridicule, but also genuine curiosity and interest from atheists. It's like so I'll ask it in a similar way that they would ask you. what evidence do you have that God exists? Because there is none. And they would say, and why are you sticking God in a process where he doesn't belong?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. Well, I do think he
Yeah.
does belong. As I've argued, I think natural selection is teleological. But I'll avoid that because that is incredibly complicated and it would take a lot of groundwork to sort of build up. Let's just use the same principles that I've just used to argue for evolution, which is what which explanation of the universe, of the facts of nature is the least ad hoc, is the simplest. Now let's look at the fine tuning of the universe. The fact that the universe is perfectly precision guided to allow for the eventual evolution of life and intelligent life like us. Let's look at the fact that the universe is contingent. The fact that, it is completely plausible to ask why is there something rather than nothing? And that seems to necessitate some sort of thing that's self-explanatory, a necessary existing being. And ask that sort of question. Why is it the universe seems to, at least right now, it seems to have had a beginning point? I could keep going on. This is what's called natural theology. This is the apologetic arguments that are thrown out there. Now, again, you can. I don't think atheists are completely at a loss for explanations. I think they can throw them out there, right? But the question then becomes: are they acting like young Earth creationists then? To put this
Throwing ad
provocatively,
hoc explanations
yeah.
out
Well,
there.
maybe
Yeah.
there's an infinite number of universes, and we happen to be in the one that has that. Well, maybe there's other models that will replace Big Bang cosmology, the Friedman Lemaitre model. Maybe there's this, maybe there's that, maybe there's that. And again, conject, adding things to fit in the model. This is why I think, there's only two or three, I think, really legitimate arguments for atheism. Incompatibility arguments, obviously the problem of evil. That's, I mean, maybe the divine hiddenness you could throw in there. That's about it. But there are dozens of arguments for the existence of God that are at least plausible. And so then it becomes which of these explanations better comports with the facts we know. And it's nearly a gluttony of riches that if you just, again, take a step back and look at all the evidence, I think you cannot say, it's nearly logically demanded, you cannot say that theism is not a better explanation of the facts. Again, you can have a more ad hoc explanation of the facts of nature, but again, it is more ad hoc. If I think atheists quite often operate like functional young earth creationists and saying, look, we have this explanation for fine tuning. We have this other distinct explanation for the beginning of the universe, with this other distinct explanation for the contingency of the universe, and on and on and on. Whereas I just say theism explains it all. Case closed.
Gotcha. So we got a couple comments real quick in the chat. So help us understand why evolution has some kind of limit, because I've often heard theoretically there are no limits to how a species could adapt.
Okay, so you want me to explain Behe's argument, in other words?
Yeah.
Yeah, so what Behe basically says is in his published scientific work, he argues that point mutations, there's a certain limit on it's an extension of his irreducible complexity argument, where he basically argues that when you actually look at how many sort of point mutations that you would need or the development of certain novel features, he basically sets a limit and saying, here is the observable facts. And he uses E. coli, which is his specialization. Very smart on his part.
Mm.
And he basically says, we've run E. coli experiments for a long time. And he uses malaria as well, again, within his area of specialization. We understand how far malaria can evolve given a certain set, given a paradigm of like of our studies. This is how far it's been able to evolve given a certain amount of time. Sorry, I'm mixing up my words here. I'm starting to sound like Joe Biden. Uh, Maybe I shouldn't have said that.
You're good.
But basically, what he ends up developing is basically saying, given the fact that we've measured, there's been this many individuals of E. coli and malaria and stuff like this, and this is the extent of how much they've been able to evolve to overcome certain, especially like in malaria's case, been able to overcome resistances to our attacks on them, such as chloroquine. Um, in order to sort of treat that, we can then use this as a model and extend it to other organisms and say, this seems like a good way of developing a model for how far evolution can develop novelty thus far and no farther, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Okay.
So
And so
basically scaling up because there's been so many population, it's been such a massive population. There's been trillions of E. coli. There's been trillions of malarial of malaria. And so we were able to basically extrapolate from that.
Gotcha. So this person brings up something really interesting, which I think will relate to the next question that I have for you. And so, in order for Christians to be evolutionary creationists, theistic evolutionists, whatever the term, uh, it needs to at least not contradict the Bible.
Yes,
Now,
that's a
granted,
big reason.
right? Granted, that depends on your view of Scripture, but putting that whole discussion aside for and what biblical doctrines you have that like
Mhm.
presume your understandings, putting that aside for the moment, let's assume it should not at least should not contradict Scripture. It would seem like the fact that we are apes, according to evolution, would suggest that there it seems like it's in contradiction with the idea that we are in the image of God and we are somehow special.
Yeah.
So help us understand if you have any comment on that. Help us
Yeah.
understand that.
In one sense, we are apes in a sort of scientific classification, but in another sense, to say that we are apes because we derived from apes, you might as well say we're fish because we derived from fish. The
Hmm.
logic there does not follow. And theologically, I think we can still hold out that there is something unique about us. And it's exactly what you talked about, the image of God. Now, what's understood about the image of God is there's three different ideas about the image of God. One is a substantive, the others next is relational, and the last is what's called a functional. Substantive, it means there's something unique about us. There's something, like whether it's our rationality or our amazing wit and good sense of humor. I'm just teasing. There's something about us, ontologically that makes us distinct, and that's the image of God. That's sort of the traditional view. And I think if you believe in evolution, maybe that will challenge it because, but at the same time, you don't have to. I think just the fact of looking around at other organisms and seeing that they're actually smarter than we give them credit for, that actually is a challenge. So I don't think evolution is particularly challenging to that view of the image of God. Number two is the relational view, which is the fact that our image of God comes from the fact that we have a relationship with God. That's not challenged by evolution because no matter where we came from, obviously God has established a very unique relationship with us. And number three is the functional view. And this is actually the most popular today. This is what Old Testament scholars are arguing for. And that is the image of God has nothing to do with us or our relationships. It has everything to do with the fact that God has given us a certain function. Let us create man in our image to rule.
Hmm.
The image of God is tied to the function we play in creation, that we are rulers of creation. And so the image of God is not so much about what makes us unique, but more so what God has commanded us to do, which is why Colossians, when it looks at Jesus, it says, He is the image of the invisible God. We think that's talking about his divinity, and kind of it is, but more so it's talking about his humanity. It's saying he is the one who fulfilled that obligation of ruling because now everything has been subjected to Christ. Everything is subjected to him. So a biblical understanding of the image of God is not I'm unique because of my rationality or where I came from, whether I came from it. It's what has God told me to do and how am I fulfilling that? How much do I look like Christ now? Now we live looking at the true image of God, which is Christ. Now, if you want me to, I can address just the biblical issues very quickly.
Uh, about the image of God and like us being apes or other
Just more
issues.
generally.
Yeah, you can do that. So staying in Genesis for a
Yeah.
moment, of course, we have 6 days, right? God resting on the seventh, and God seems to create stuff each day. Um, young Earth creationists, of course, are going to say these are literal 24-hour days.
Yeah.
Old Earth creationists are going to say, well, no. But even if you allow for a young Earth or old Earth creationist understanding, there still seems to be a incompatibility with uh, the pattern by which God creates stuff
Yeah.
and evolution. So how do you understand the creation days?
Yeah, so I don't actually have a firm 100% view. I think there are multiple good models, and that's okay with me. There's plenty of passages in scripture that I'm like, I really don't know. There's a couple competing models, and I think they're good. And now, for some people, it's like, no, it's as clear as day, you know, but it's not. So, for instance, people say, well, it says first and day, second day, third day. And obviously, if you're talking about that, you're talking about literal days. Well, no, not necessarily. Creation. Some younger creationists will say anytime a day is used with a number, it means a literal day, but that's objectively not true because Hosea 6:2 is a counterexample to that. If you get into the Hebrew, so is Zechariah 14:7. Um, and in addition to that, that's actually a testable hypothesis that this is the obvious interpretation of Genesis, that it's 6 literal consecutive 24-hour days. That's testable. Let's put it to the test, because what young earth creationists will add is they'll say nobody who hasn't been in some sense corrupted by contemporary scientific opinion would ever think these are anything other than 24-hour days. Oh, really? Let's ask the early church fathers, shall we? The people who lived in the first 400 to 500 years of the church. Now, that's 1,000 years before Darwin for most of these figures. What did they think? They had no scientific reason to deny 6 literal 24-hour days. So I went and looked. And I just took the most prominent figures and I said, what was their opinion on the Genesis days? And what I found was about 1 in 3 did not believe those days were literal. Irenaeus, who was a guy who was discipled by John, the Apostle John, so just a couple generations removed from the Apostle John, thought these days were long periods of time. Origen said, who wrote the first commentaries on a lot of these books, basically said, you can interpret these days however you want to. And then you get to St. Augustine, the most influential figure probably in Christian history, who is the hero of the Reformation. It's who Martin Luther referenced.
Yeah.
Very important figure. No one's going to deny his orthodoxy. He wrote a book, ironically called The Literal Interpretation of Genesis. What does he say about the days of Genesis? He says it would be foolish. Only a fool would interpret these as literal days. He's
Yeah.
writing in the late 4th, early 5th century. This is, again, 1,000 years before modern evolutionary theory. And you have the most prominent figures of Christianity who are reading these words saying, there's multiple interpretations of this. So this has been a debate that's always been going on in the church. This has been a debate that it may precede the church, because I found some Jewish authors in the 1st century who were debating what these days meant. So it might be a debate that precedes Christianity. So,
Mhm.
rather than getting into what I believe in the models, I just want to let people know this is a debate. You are not denying, or this is not a capitulation to atheism or secularism or anything like that. Christians have always debated if these are literal 24-hour days.
Yeah, and like I said, I do think that's really important because uh, now obviously young Earth creationists differ. Like you're gonna find Dr. Marcus Ross, and he's like, yeah, theistic, Christian theistic evolutionists, Christians are Christians, no problem. We just disagree about interpretive stuff. But you're gonna get the more fundamentalist types who are more
Yeah.
no, this is like you're essentially rejecting Jesus and the resurrection if you don't believe in literal days because, why would you interpret the resurrection literally? Maybe that's an allegory for the evolutionary experience of the species or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, they'll really say things like that.
Or
So,
you'll get things like, it's the foundation for every major Christian doctrine, which again, that'd be really ironic when Christian orthodoxy, formed by the church fathers, they didn't consider that to be essential to church doctrine, the major doctrines.
yeah, yeah, definitely. And so, continuing on from that, do you have any thoughts about the long ages of the patriarchs? For example, Methuselah in Genesis 5 lives 969 years. And
Yeah.
then, of course, the flood happens, which is understood to be a global event under young Earth creationism. And then you get the ages decreasing
Yeah.
over time. And so, do you have any particular thoughts on that?
Yeah. So here's the funny thing that, just looking through Old Testament scholarship, virtually all of them affirm, that the ages of these patriarchs is symbolic. They just can't agree on what it's symbolic for. But I'm
Mm.
going to, advocate for a friend of mine, Inspiring Philosophy. Go check out his book on the ages of these patriarchs, where he basically makes a biblical argument that these are symbolic. A very good biblical argument that says you just taking the Bible, not taking in modern science or the unbelievable ages or anything like that. We can make a good biblical case that these are symbolic numbers. Now, it might surprise people that even if these are like, let's say all this fails, I'd be completely okay with Methuselah living 969 years. That's not a problem for me.
Mm.
I really don't, because I think God can do what God wants. God can do what God wants. If God wants to supernaturally preserve a few individuals throughout history, he's fully capable of doing that. I don't think we need to find a scientific reason, like maybe there's a DNA telomerase which repairs the ends of DNA, which causes people, to not age. I've heard that. Um, yeah, maybe, but at the same time, we serve a big God, and that's not a huge problem for me. But as for the flood, now that's a little bit of a more different issue.
Yeah, real quick, we do have a comment here saying the flood didn't happen, and I'm always curious, like if when the people say the flood didn't happen, if they're referring to the global flood or local, because that's really
Yeah,
important. And at least in my opinion, I'm gonna say the global flood didn't happen, but that doesn't mean nothing happened, right? So I guess
yeah.
talk to us about why what your view on the flood is, if there's evidence for it, global, local, that sort of thing.
There is definitely good evidence that something major did happen. And I'm not looking at the scientific evidence so much as I am looking at the cultural, anthropological, sociological evidence, which is flood myths are so stinking prevalent across cultures. They are so stinking prevalent. Now, the common explanation for this is most early civilizations were by water. You needed water to grow crops, you needed a source of fresh water. So when floods happened, it was absolutely devastating. So it makes sense why separate cultures would develop separate flood myths, because a flood was just so devastating. But that does not account for the fact of incidental details in these flood accounts that go beyond what these sort of simple explanations by, well, floods were bad for these cultures. It goes beyond what they can explain. I think that tells us something. Do think that tells us of a common shared cultural memory. Now, I don't believe in a local flood, or I don't believe in a global flood. I do believe that, whether we want to call it global, I do believe there was some sort of catastrophic flood event that wiped out the world at that time. And people say, well, why not global? Well, let's look at the language itself. The Hebrew word there, koleretz, which my Hebrew's terrible, but I believe that that's the term used there. Koleretz is a term that means whole earth or entire land. So which one is it? Well, let's let scripture interpret scripture. Where is that term also used? It's also used with Joseph later on in Genesis, when it says the whole earth came to Joseph in Egypt to get food during this famine. We do not that anyone that I know of interprets that as thinking Native Americans sailed across the Atlantic to go to Egypt to get food. We
Right.
obviously need and understand the word koleretz there, the term, the whole world came to Joseph. We understand that as just the area, the world around them, right? The world that they knew. We understand that they're speaking in a language that was a common term back then. And we don't need to impose what we understand by the word world by what they understood by the word world. So you're not saying it's not a literal interpretation. You're interpreting words as they meant them.
Mhm.
And so I would say it's perfectly plausible to interpret the same thing in the flood account. That there was an account, there was a flood that flooded the whole world as they knew it. It affected everyone. It killed off everyone that they knew of. And God supernaturally preserved some 8 people and some animals. There you go.
And, I mean, just to add on to this, the ESV Study Bible, the one published in 2008, is a very conservative study Bible, right? Like
Mhm.
they're
Yeah.
not going insane with any of the stuff. I don't know what the thoughts of each person who attributed study notes to it, but yeah, like I said, they're a very conservative thing, and there is a note in on one of the verses from the scholar. I have it in the script that I'm writing that says, yeah, it might have been universal from their vantage point, but that's because their vantage point of the world was smaller than ours.
Mhm.
And so, people will also go to the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 and say, this land that's being described as the nations in Genesis 10, that's what they're concerned about. They don't
Mhm.
care about North America, for example. They probably didn't even know that it existed, right? So, yeah, I mean, that's not a heretical position. That position is found even among conservative biblical scholars, it seems.
Yeah. Can I throw in? I see a question in the chat. That's a good question.
Yeah, is it this one by chance?
When Jesus spoke of Noah, I think he was referring to Noah. I mean, I do think
Yeah,
there was a Noah, yeah. It's
yeah.
actually the top one. Why worry about the
Oh,
animals if the flood wasn't global?
yeah,
Why
good
worry about the
question.
animals? Great question, right? Well, if the flood was still catastrophic, right? These sort of catastrophic events still can cause extinctions. If you don't have a sort of new population to grow from, then you're not going to be able to replenish the land as quickly. Having a sort of founding population, if a founding population, you can reestablish the land and regrow. You have to remember, the flood is meant to be an undoing of creation, an
Hmm.
undoing of creation, in the
Yeah,
sense that the world started formless and void, and waters were and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the spirit of God, it was covered in water. Then God recovered it in water. And Noah is meant to be, in a sense, a new Adam, in that sense,
yeah,
a new Adam. And these new creatures are, in a sense, meant to be a new sort of founding population in that land. Now, my question always, if it's a global flood, why only bring two animals? Because what happens when the predators get hungry?
yeah,
They
yeah.
eat an animal and that species goes extinct. You would want to bring larger amounts. And
Hmm.
yes, I know some clean animals, there were seven, but that's still not enough. If there were a large population of carnivores, they would either go extinct or they would cause the extinction of other species. So if it's actually a global flood, this is always my response. You would actually want to bring more than two animals. You would want a bigger boat or God to bring more. So that's just bad logic on God's part, which we don't want to say of God, right?
Hmm. So, this person also has a good comment. So, how can you tell when something should be taken as literal narrative or more poetically or hyperbole? I know I can. I have a couple of comments on this. At least from my view, I take the functional view of Genesis that like John Walton and others have. So I think it is literally. I think the creation account in Genesis 1 and 2 is literally describing something, and I think it's true. It's just that what it's literally describing is not material creation, but rather functional creation. And I try to point that out to people because a lot of people, atheists and Christian alike, have this dichotomy where it's all literal or it's all hyperbole or poetically, or they'll use those terms
Yeah.
interchangeably, even though they're technically different literary devices. But I say the young Earth creationist literal interpretation is not the only literal interpretation on offer for people, and I think that's important.
Yeah.
But
And
back to the
it,
initial question.
go
Uh,
ahead. Sorry.
no, you're good. So, but back to the initial question though, how can we tell the
Yeah.
difference?
Yeah.
So,
So, in the question of genre is always a question, right? Sometimes it's super easy. We don't interpret Revelation literally, at least not 100% literally. There are debates on what you take literally and what you don't. And sometimes it is difficult. And so let's just admit that up front. And in the Genesis text, it's neither prose nor is it poetry. It's what's called exalted prose. It's sometimes called exalted prose. There's poetic elements to it. And it's obviously speaking in a genre that's laden with what's called, I don't want this to be misinterpreted, mythological concepts. By myth, I don't mean fake. By mythological, I mean this thing sort of denotes something much bigger. So, for instance, the serpent is a very easy illustration. We don't take that to be a literal serpent. We take that to be Satan. And the New Testament confirms that the serpent was Satan. But why call it a serpent? Well, because that denoted a sort of chaos creature. It was symbolic of Leviathan, the sort of antagonistic force to human culture and society and the goodness of God. So serpent is a wonderful way of portraying some sort of evil spiritual force working against God and humanity. And you could say, well, he took the form of a serpent as well, but it still calls him the most crafty animal, creature that God had created. It's portraying it as a literal animal that can talk. And it also portrays God as sort of wandering through the garden and then being surprised. It's like, oh my gosh, what has happened? What have you done? And asking these questions. And the very, very literalistic interpretation would say God was ignorant. God didn't know. That's what it meant. If we can go back retroactively and say, well, we know God isn't ignorant. We know God is all knowing and this sort of stuff. But then all of a sudden, we're not taking the text at its word. So I think everyone treats the Genesis text, Genesis 1 through 3, as something that has symbolic elements in it, this sort of mythological elements to it. The question is just how much? How
yeah,
much are we willing to read it this way? And I think when you get into and understand what's called mytho-historical literature, you begin to recognize that the days themselves can be understood in this way. Now, what they actually mean, this is where scholars differ, and this is why I don't hold a firm opinion, because I think there's a lot of good ideas out there. But I hold it to the first few chapters of the Bible in the same way I do the last few chapters of the Bible, that we need to be open to people disagreeing because the Bible itself is not 100% clear, and just be okay with that. Because where the Bible needs to be clear, it's very clear.
Yeah, I think that's important, and I would say that there are definitely literary cues as well. We think about and this is another thing I try to help people understand too, who have this dichotomy. Like, you can describe historical events poetically, and that happens a lot in the Bible. In fact, one of the really cool things that happens in the book of Exodus is Moses' mother sings a song about the Exodus,
Mhm.
and it's a song. It's not a narrative prose. It is not literal wording. This is poetic. It's a song, but it's a song about a literal event. And we understand this in our culture. We have songs that are clearly using wordplay and all these other things, but are describing an event that happened in the life of the artist who made the song. And so that's another thing I try to note too. But some of those cues are things like, if you're comparing animals to humans, it might not be without it. It's probably a figure of speech. It's probably more poetic. So, like
Yeah.
Psalm 22, right? The bulls of Bashan surround me, the psalmist says.
Mhm.
This is a poetic way of referring to humans. And we would say to the enemies of Christ at the crucifixion, right? So,
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, I just get back to nobody thinks God was ignorant when he's walking through the garden. And he's
yeah.
just like, oh my gosh, what happened? Right. It's portraying God as a character in the narrative who's very much like a human being. And it's also portraying the serpent in the same way. And zero Christians I know take that literally. And so let's just be open and admit that nobody takes the passage 100% literally. We understand there are what are called mythological elements in this. That's not to say they're fake. It just means we need to be more careful when we interpret them.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, moving on a little bit, because we could spend
Yeah.
forever on that, and I do want to be respectful of both of our times, actually. So Jesus, I've heard a lot of young Earth creationists point to Jesus, and they will say Jesus believed in a young Earth.
Yeah.
And part of the way that they do this is by going through some of Jesus' statements about like the foundation of the earth, or Mark 10:6 here I will read real quick. He's talking about marriage and divorce, and he says, "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female."
Yeah.
And so, and there are other statements too. Mark 19 is a parallel story about Jesus talking about divorce, in Mark 19:4, or excuse me, Matthew 19:4 says a very similar thing. So it sounds like Jesus is saying that from the beginning, the humans were created and they were created male and female, and that's how
It
young
does, doesn't it?
creationists
Yeah.
understand it. So why are you denying Jesus' words?
I
That's
know, right?
basically.
Right. That's the open and shut case they always give is like if Jesus said it, you'd have to deny Jesus and therefore Jesus was wrong about things. And
Yeah,
of course, nobody wants to say that. If Jesus really did affirm young earth creationism, that is open and shut. But let's
yeah.
look at the passage again. At the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Let me ask you this, Izzy. When was mankind created? Humanity. When was it created? Was it at the beginning of creation or was it at the end of creation?
Towards the end, right?
It
The
was the
sixth
end.
day.
It's the last
Yeah.
thing. So at the beginning of creation, God made no, no, God made them at the end of creation. So, what do you do with that? He obviously he's not talking about the creation week. I don't think that's what they interpret this as. They just assume when they hear creation, they think, "Oh, he's talking about the creation week," right? But if you take this, I mean, if you read this literally, then he's wrong. Jesus is wrong. So it's actually the young earth creationist who would also be saying he's wrong. Now, what I think he means is at the beginning of creation, what is the context? This is something that I teach in my own university. It's a little phrase. Context is king.
Mhm.
What is the context that he's talking about? He's talking about marriage. So when he says at the beginning of creation, he doesn't mean creation of everything. He means either the creation of humanity or the creation of marriage. He's talking very narrowly about the creation of humanity and the bonding God had. because there's what's called an etiology, which basically means that in ancient cultures, if you look back at the foundation of something, they usually thought of that as archetypal, as sort of ideal.
Mhm.
So when Jesus is appealing to the archetype, the ideal, he goes back to the very beginning of when God first made man and woman. So that's what I think is going on in that passage. It doesn't make sense for him to appeal to creation writ large. Not only would that be contradictory, it doesn't make sense. What he's doing is he's making an etiological argument, which would have made sense in that culture, which is God made at the beginning when he first created us, when he first created marriage, he made it between man and woman, and what God has brought together, no person should separate. And that's what I think he's saying there. And that's it. To try to read in 7-day creationism into an account that very clearly isn't talking about that is a textbook case of what's called eisegesis. It's reading what you want into scripture rather than allowing the context to more narrowly tell you what is being communicated.
Yeah, I often I I refer to it as overreading the text where people will uh put too much information into a text or make it say too much, and that happens with like word concept fallacy
Yep.
sometimes, where they look at the, let's say, the Greek word
Yeah.
for church and import all of this meaning into the word church in
Hmm.
one usage, when it's like, well, he probably didn't mean all of these different things, he meant one thing. It's the analogy is like, it's also the illegitimate transfer fallacy as well. So, like if I said, that's one strike, right? And I'm in a bowling alley, I mean a strike as it pertains to the sport of bowling. I
Right.
don't mean a strike on my criminal record. I don't right, right. I don't
Right.
mean I was struck, right? I was hit. I mean one thing. And so with that being said, then I was also taught this too.
It's a good
In
analogy.
grasping God's word, also talks about this. Where like, yeah, context limits the meaning of of things, and so I've often heard people say that you can interpret the text however you want to get infinite number of meanings, but that's only and grasping God's word points this out. That's only true
Yeah.
if you ignore context. But
Hmm.
if you let the context limit meaning, then meaning is therefore limited.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, no, I think that they're not allowing the context to limit Jesus' statements
Yeah.
here. So now another thing that I've actually been struggling with myself is Romans 5. So
Hmm.
this is a big thing. It gets into a lot of other discussions. I can't read the whole passage, but it's Romans 5:12 through 21. But in Paul's letter to the Romans, he says, "Therefore, just as sin into the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way, death came to all people because all sinned." That's the New International Version. I just point that out because I've read some commentaries on this, and people have pointed out that
Yeah.
you can translate this differently. I don't want to get into all that though. So the idea here is that sin and death, like physical death, came through one person. It's
Yeah.
because of one person that we die, and that's Adam.
Hmm.
And uh, so that would be a and that's not really just young earth creationist way of thinking about it. Like other church fathers have also said, yeah, physical death came through Adam. Some even blamed the death of animals on Adam,
Hmm.
although some also didn't. uh so this is a very long standing interpretation of this passage. What
Yeah.
reason do we have to disagree with that?
Yeah. So there's multiple interpretations, but first let's make something clear. This is not talking about animal death because let's look at the passage again. So death spread to all who? To all people because all sinned. To all people. The context again is talking about human death. And I think that's key because there is something that's untranslatable in this. Now, this is, in speaking with some of my friends who are very good Greek scholars, but some of them maintain that there is a distinction in Paul between nekros and thanatos, which are both translated death or dead, but they're different Greek words and they're used quite often in different contexts. So, for instance, death seems to equate with bios, which is the word for life, in the sense of bodily death. An animal has bios. Uh, but whenever if you were to shoot me, I would no longer have bios. I would have necros. I'd be dead in that sense. But that's different from zoe and Thanatos, Zoe and Thanatos, which is also where we get Thanos, right? Zoe is a deeper life. It's what John uses when he says, "In him was life." He's not talking about biological life. He's not saying in him he was a living creature. He's not talking about God as like a living creature, like a snail or a lizard or something like that, or any other living creature. He's saying there's something deeper, Zoe, life. And equated with that is Thanatos. For the wages of sin is death. You are dead. We are dead now. But obviously, I'm not physically dead. I'm not physically dead, but I am dead in my sins. I'm dead. There's something about me that was dead prior to Christ. And so there's a different sort of death. And I think we sometimes talk about spiritual and physical death. I think that roughly correlates. But at the same time, there's a lot more nuances there. But what the question then becomes, what word is Paul using in Romans in that passage? He's using Thanatos. He's using the word that I believe denotes spiritual death. That when we sinned, you know, it's nearly implied in the passage itself in Genesis, the day you eat of this, you will surely die. But he didn't die that day. There's some sort of deeper death that goes on there, something beyond just physical death. Now, that's not to say that physical death isn't also an effect of sin. I think that's a different case. But again, context, what Paul is talking about in that passage is this deeper spiritual death, what Revelation calls the second death, this destruction of us, not just bodily, but body and soul in hell. As Jesus said, don't be afraid of the one who destroys the body, both body and soul in hell. There's two different concepts of death. And what Paul is talking about that Adam's sin did was this deeper, more spiritual death. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so we don't have to go on too long a tangent about this, but the way that you spoke there made you sound like an annihilationist or a conditionalist. I don't know
Yeah.
if you hold that view or not, but would you say that a conditionalist or annihilist take, which by the way just says that hell is the
Yeah.
destruction, the death of a person, body, and soul? Would you say that that fits better with what's going on here in Romans
Well,
and then in
those weren't
Genesis?
my words; those were Jesus's words. Don't be afraid of the one who destroys the body, but you be afraid of the one who destroys both body and soul in hell. Now, what does that mean? Now, some people say there's three parts to this: body, soul, and spirit. Right? When I talked about spiritual death as well, what does that mean? I leave that open for interpretation. I personally find annihilationism it's attractive some days. Some days I think that's a really good view. I don't necessarily hold to it, and that's mostly just the force of the church tradition. I think the church tradition
Okay.
really weighs upon me and saying, you know what, there's a lot smarter people than me who've said this is probably a better interpretation. But again, if someone holds to that, that's a view that goes way back in church history, which is something that shocked me. Annihilationists have been in the church for a long time, and they've always
Yeah,
that's something that's surprising. So I leave that open. I will say leave that open. I don't advocate for that view, but that is a possible interpretation.
gotcha. And so you would say Romans 5 here is talking about spiritual death.
Mhm.
So, but in Romans 14, though, he says, "Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking a command,
Yeah.
as did Adam, who is a
Mhm.
pattern of the one to come." Now, uh, do you think that that verse would make more sense in your view? That because if it's physical death, then why stop the time from Adam to Moses? Is kind of the question. At least I have. If
Yeah.
it's a
Why
physical
stop it at
death,
Moses, right? Because what
yeah.
happened with Moses?
I mean, he died. Like he literally, yeah,
Well, he did die, but why
yeah.
why Moses? Why I mean, a lot of people died. Why
Oh,
Moses? The reason is the law came with Moses, which is really big in Pauline theology, right?
right.
With the law then became the possibility of not sinning, right? Because then you could know what God wants, right? Death still reigned, even though they didn't have a command. So there's also a distinction in Paul between a sin and a transgression. A sin is just doing something bad. A transgression is when you know it's bad and then you do it anyway. And that's what makes sin.
Mm,
There's a verse where he says that's what makes sin truly sinful, right? That's what made Adam's sin so bad is he had an instruction from God, don't eat this, and then he didn't do it. So he had a law and then broke it. So then the reason he ends it with Moses is basically he's offering this new law, the possibility for obedience, which we then rejected again, and thus the reign of Thanatos continued. That's why he ends it. That's that whole point there is there wasn't a command from God, but nevertheless, there still was this separation between us and God, even though there wasn't this command. God wasn't talking to Methuselah or Enoch, at least, well, Enoch probably, but Methuselah, we have no record of a law being given to them. And yet, nevertheless, there still was this separation. There's something that needed to be fixed with Christ. That's basically all he's saying there.
Gotcha. So, um, I don't know if you've heard about this, but I'm curious. William Hurst has argued for a moral death in this passage. So, I think he'll say Romans 5
Mhm.
and into Romans 6 is talking about more the death of the character, and he argues this from like the context that Paul is writing in. This is how some people talked about character. They talked about life and death as bad character and good character, and he makes other arguments there. I don't know. Have you heard about this? Are you
I
sympathetic to that
have.
view?
Don't think it's. I take a stronger view than he does. I think because the word thanatos is used. Well, what's really interesting is Christ was raised from the necros, the physical death, but it then also says Christ experienced thanatos. He experienced the full measure of death that was due to us. But then it says he was raised from necros, which is just bodily death. Why? Why does Paul switch terms there?
Mm,
Because what Christ experienced in Thanatos, he conquered. He conquered Thanatos. He brought reunification through himself. So the resurrection from the dead, what he experienced, was only Necros because he'd already conquered Thanatos.
mm.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
That's
So
why
you,
Paul switches terms there. I think that's why he does that. So I think we need to see this as something more than just moral death, because I don't think Christ suffered moral death when he died, Thanatos. I don't think Christ was morally dead, experienced moral death. You know what I'm saying? I think there's something deeper. I think he experienced that full separation, that full destruction that was due to us, and then conquered it.
Gotcha. So, do you think this a similar thing is going on in First Corinthians 15? So, this is a famous passage, particularly
Yeah.
if you're in apologetics, right? Because Paul lays out this what seems to be a creed in the first few verses, where Christ died, raised, and is
Mhm.
witnessed according to the scriptures. He continues on, and then verses 20 through 28 compare Adam to Christ, just like Paul does in Romans 5. He says things like, "For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all are made alive."
Yeah.
He calls Adam the first man and Christ the second man. So, of course, and even me, I was a young Earth creationist before this, and so I understood this to be, yeah, Adam is the first human
Yeah.
ever, right? According to Paul, and it is because of him that we all physically die. So why
Yeah.
have a different view?
Yeah, so I interpret that passage for an Adam all die. It's not just physical death. It's this Thanatos. It's this deeper moral death, or not moral. Excuse me. It's this deeper spiritual death. And in Christ, all are made alive. But this isn't just like God's. It's not just a resuscitation. It's not. I don't just look forward to a life like this. I look forward to Zoe, a deeper, full life, the life that God promises us. This eternal life that's just not durational, but it's also a greater intensity of life. And so that's what I think is going on there. And we need to be careful when he says, "For all as in Adam all die, so in Christ all are made alive." Because unless you're a universalist and don't believe that anyone will ever be in at some point, no one will be in hell. You don't think all will be made alive in Christ. So just be very, very careful how you interpret that passage. The all there means all nations, because Adam, Paul uses Adam because he thinks in some sense that Adam is the sort of progenitor of all nations, that in some sense all nations can trace themselves back to Adam, that it comes through Adam. That's why, that because his concern is Jew Gentile, right? He's basically saying, stop dividing Jew and Gentile. We all have the same problem because we're all come from Adam. That's what he's doing there when he says all. He's talking about both Jew and Gentile, people of all nations. He doesn't mean all every single individual, because otherwise you'd have to be a universalist. So be very careful interpreting that passage. Um, Number two, you brought up um, he calls Adam the first man, but then
Mhm.
you rightfully pointed out that he called Christ the second man. He's not talking about chronology. Christ was not the second person ever. No, Christ was not the second person ever. Obviously, Cain, Abel, and Seth, not me, predated Christ. So he's not talking about that. What is he talking about? Well, he also calls Christ the last man.
Hmm.
So this is a list of two. If you're second and you're last, it means there's a list of two. There's Adam and then there's Christ, and everyone else is not there. What is that list? It's the kind of person you are. The first one is what Paul calls the fleshly man, the person under the reign of Thanatos. And Paul talks about this in First Corinthians, that the fleshly man, he contrasts that with the spiritual man. The second one is the spiritual man, the one who has Zoe, the one who is alive in Christ. And the sort of token example of each is Adam, who sinned, who had God's law and sinned, and then the second Adam, the one who had God's law and was faithful to it, and thus brought redemption to all who are in him.
Okay.
So it's
So
about
I
kinds
want
of people.
to.
Sorry.
I no, you're good. You're good. So I want to challenge you a little bit on this real quick. So verse 21 says, "For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man." Now, the contrast here is and the comparison is really important, but Paul here, the entire chapter, he's talking about the bodily resurrection.
Hmm.
So why wouldn't this death in First Corinthians 15 that we all suffer through one man
Yeah.
not also be bodily if the resurrection that he contrasts it to is bodily?
Well, let me ask you this question: who gets raised at the end of days? Is it just the righteous, or is it the righteous and the unrighteous?
Both. I would say both.
Both. Both. So if he says through Christ we are raised from the dead, but wait a second, the unrighteous aren't raised from the dead because of Christ. Without Christ, we'd all be raised from the dead and then condemned again, so to speak, for our own sin. The resurrection he is talking about is Zoe, is a resurrection to a new life, to a higher form of life, to become what we were meant to be, what Christ modeled after his own resurrection. It's a greater intensity of life. Does that make sense?
Okay, so you would still understand this passage, even though there's that resurrection there and the
Yeah.
death. It's still spiritual because the resurrection there is to newness of
Because the
life
unrighteous, yeah,
in a
it's
deeper. Yeah,
aren't being raised because of Jesus's death and resurrection. They're being raised because God's gonna judge them,
right.
right? That was gonna
Hmm.
happen one way or the other. That resurrection that he's putting hope in is a resurrection to a higher form of life, to eternal life, which John defines as not duration, but as knowing God, our true end and goal.
Gotcha. Okay, and so one other quick point. I'm sorry. This passage is really long and really interesting to me.
Yeah.
I don't know why I find this like First Corinthians 15 more interesting than Romans 5. Maybe I'm the heretic, but so he also calls death the enemy.
Yes.
Now, this relates, so would you say that the death that is last to be conquered is spiritual death?
I think that is I think both are. Because I think one is a greater intensification of the other, if that makes sense. It's you might think of this as levels. Both are bad. God does not want creatures to die, both either physically or spiritually at all. Because God, I mean, that's just not in the nature of God. So the last enemy to be conquered, I'd have to see what the Greek word is there, but I could see it being either. Because that is something God wishes to conquer. But the bigger issue is always going to be Thanatos because that is the deeper, more intense form of death. It's not just something that Christ, suffered necros, right? And then he went into Thanatos. He went into that and conquered it. That's what Christ did. He suffered that as well, but only to conquer it. But then he stayed dead. He stayed dead for 3 days. He stayed in necros for 3 days, right? And we can talk about why that is and whatever. But at the same time, that the real enemy is Thanatos. This is our spiritual separation from God. That is the thing that must be conquered, which is why, Paul can talk about himself, can talk about the sinner as being dead, even while they're still walking around and breathing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, that helps a little bit. It's interesting because some scholars have noted that Paul is talking about death a little bit differently in Romans 5,
Yes,
1 Corinthians 12. That's why I wanted to challenge you a little bit on that.
absolutely.
So, real quick, we can address this comment here. So, do you consider Adam and Eve to still be the first evolved people? How does Adam and Eve fit into your
You know, I,
understanding?
I'd be open to that. I mean, a good friend, Joshua Swamidas, he's pointed out a way we could consider it that
Yeah, the
instead of
sort of
talk, yeah,
the what is his
genealogical.
book called? Yeah, the genealogical Adam. Yeah.
Yeah. Andrew Loke is another good friend of mine. He also considers Adam and Eve to be the first one. I don't necessarily think you need that. I don't. I think of that they were elected by God. I think God is in the business of election. So this is my biblical theology playing. God elects them as sort of representatives for humankind in that sense. I do think that I do actually think that biblically we should see them as um, probably being in the genealogy of everyone. I think it's safe to assume that and I think Joshua Swami Das has cleared up that issue quite nicely. But I don't think there is a single biblical passage that says they must be the first human beings ever. And in fact, I think there might be good reason to think they weren't. And that is because I don't see Genesis 2 as a recapitulation of chapter 1. And you mentioned John
Yeah,
Walton. I think he's quite convincing on that. Recapitulation was not an idea that I think really takes place in Genesis. It really doesn't. I see Genesis 2 as happening after Genesis 1.
gotcha. Yeah, no, I would actually agree with you there, and I know Walton Middleton, J. Richard Middleton, has also
Mhm.
talked about the Toledot formula in Genesis, and how that functions, and how that's evidence for that as well. So if we have physical death prior to the fall, then um, and so would you, real quick, I guess, as a clarification point. So sin definitely comes through Adam. What about the people before Adam? Were they sinning? And if not, then how do we, what do we consider their actions as? Are they, is
Yeah.
it moral? Is it immoral? Does that correlate to sin, or is that different?
I don't think that that is an issue. That is a very weird issue. I do think obviously they died, but I don't think that's an issue that's very particular to my view. I think Paul himself was wrestling with that with the passage you mentioned, which was the fact that people died after Adam because they sinned, but they didn't have a law. Like let's open up that Roman passage again. Let me see if I can find it. Yet
Hmm.
death reigned. This is verse 14. Death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was the
Hmm.
type of the one who was to come. Talking about Christ. So I think Paul is wrestling with this: is why are people, they sin but they didn't have a law, and the transgression is worse. That's what makes sin truly sinful. It's when you know what you're doing and yet you still do it anyway. That's whenever you're disobedient. You're not just doing something that you could claim ignorance to. I think Paul is also wrestling with that, but he doesn't give us a solution here. And so I think this is a problem for everyone. It's why. Why is God, because Paul himself introduces it. Why are people from Adam to Moses who didn't have the law of God, who were sinning but didn't actually know they were sinning? Why were they succumbing to death? So I think the same problem happens with people prior to Adam as well. Is I do think they were dying. I do think sin had been introduced into the world. And in my article that I mentioned earlier with Bethany Soloretter, I offer a proposed solution to this, which is I do think that there were natural evils going on. I do think that that were caused by a prior fall of angels, of an angelic fall. I think that explains a
Okay.
lot of this as well. This is why I think this is hinted at in the Genesis account. This is why Adam and Eve were only conditionally immortal. They had to eat of the tree of life to be immortal, which is why
Hmm.
getting cast out of the garden was a punishment because we are very naturally towards mortality. We're naturally like we will die unless of this external thing, this external act of grace that God gives us that gives us eternal life. So we're already beings towards necros. That's in the Genesis account. It's only because God supernaturally gave Adam and Eve, supernaturally, I had to use that term, right? Get this act of grace that they were able to live forever in theory. And of course, because of their transgression, they were kicked out of the garden. They were denied that fullness of life.
Gotcha. Okay.
So,
So
yeah.
yeah, and so you would say this is definitely a difficult theological question, and you say the idea that angels falling corrupts nature
Yeah.
helps us solve the issue of, or it helps us solve the question of pre-Adamite sin.
Yeah. People talk about like, oh, the world before Adam's sin was perfect. That's unbiblical. There was a serpent. However you
Yeah,
interpret that, there was sin in creation because angels are created. So there was sin in creation prior to Adam's sin.
Yeah, I actually I remember distinctly thinking about that as a young Earth creationist. It's like I think angels fell before Adam sinned. So why is it Adam's sin but not the angelic fall that counts as the first sin? And I do remember thinking about that.
Well, the problem is he's very narrowly talking about the problem of humanity, right?
Yeah,
He's not talking about animals, right? Because all sin, death came to all people
men,
because
right?
all
All
sin.
people, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's he's very narrowly talking about the problem of humans because the solution is for humans as well, right? He's when Christ died and Christ was raised to life, he wasn't saving demons. He was saving humanity. So the context is just death, the Thanatos. What happened to us? Why did we, fail? Where did Thanatos come into and destroy us? And the question of Necros, I think, is interesting as well. But I think that he leaves it open for theological speculation. But the real question is what happened to our relationship with God, and how was it solved in Christ? And that's what Paul is dealing with: is us.
Gotcha. So we have another problem here. So the problem of evil is a problem for everyone, right? Like if you're a religious person, the problem of evil is a problem. I think it's pretty safe to say that, particularly in the Abrahamic faiths.
Yeah,
Like this is everywhere, right? Even I remember doing a presentation in my class, and I did a presentation on like philosophical pantheism, and the problem of evil is a problem there too,
of course.
because
Very much.
yeah, so it's a problem for everyone. However, if you're a evolutionary creationist, this seems so much more problematic because now we have mass extinction events that have occurred
Mhm.
over hundreds of millions, billions of years. People have I don't know if this is true. I have not fact checked this, but some people have responded to my comment saying that 99% of the species that we know existed have gone extinct. Um,
Yeah.
there is a lot of death, a lot of destruction, and there's actually a lot of even poetic writings about the kind of grueling world that these animals and creatures might have been involved in. So
Yeah.
that seems incredibly inconsistent with a loving and good God.
Yeah. So first, let's just say this is a problem for the young Earth creationists as well. The difference is a little bit in quantity, but it's not difference in quality. It's not a difference in kind, because all those species that went extinct, young Earth creationists tend to believe they existed and went extinct anyway. Usually, either right
Mm,
after the flood, prior to the flood, sometime in there. That just place it all in a much more narrow, I guess, very violent period of a few thousand years, right? As opposed to billions of years. I mean, you could say there were more creatures that died over that time. That's true, but that's a difference in quantity. That's not a difference in kind. So the problem is still there. But what I do think the advantage of the evolutionary creationist is that they can then appeal to something other than, well, it was the sin of Adam. I don't think that's a good solution. I really don't think that's a good solution. Although I do have very good philosophical friends who think that Adam's sin sort of retroactively affected creatures in the past. In the same way that Christ's redemption, we think, affected people in the Old Testament. So why not also Adam's sin retroactively affect, and they think,
mm,
both people and animals back then as well? If that the acts of redemption has, omnitemporal effects, why not the act that needed redemption, right? So
right.
so I don't think that's a good solution because it does seem remarkably unfair. It doesn't seem quite right for God to say, "Oh my gosh, Adam, you sinned. Now look what I have to do to these penguins in Antarctica." It's
Yeah.
it's very arbitrary. It doesn't seem, if anything, if animals, had some sort of eternal life or that sort of thing, that would make our sin even more stark contrast. That we're the only creatures out there dying. I think that we need a better theology of death in this circumstance. So what I actually do, I keep bringing up this one paper, but it keeps becoming relevant. What I do in this paper, where I respond to Bethany Solar is I say, in order to solve the problem of evil, evolutionary evil, you need a theodicy that has three elements. One, it needs to show why God and evil are inimical, that they're opposed to one another. God hates evil. Two, you need to in some way show that nevertheless it's inevitable. That if God hates evil and God's all powerful and all knowing, why does evil happen? There needs to be some sort of inevitability to it. And number three, I think you need to show that evil is instrumental. You need to show that if God is to maintain his good character, he has some sort of good that can come out of that, a good that could not have been otherwise. And otherwise, why would God just not create at all? If unless there was some sort of higher good that God was doing. So for instance, the resurrection, the death and resurrection of Jesus is something that can only happen if there is death in that sense. But
Mm,
that we would call that an incommensurable good, a good that could never be equal, but that presupposes the existence of death.
mm,
And so I try to draw out an account that incorporates all three of these, and I use Plantinga's stuff. I use quite a bit of theological and philosophical resources to show we can come up with an account. I think of evolutionary theodicy that sees evolution as an evil, one God doesn't want to have, that he would have opposed, but nevertheless he used because I think that it allowed for a greater good to result overall. Because I do think that a young Earth creationist could say, why, even if you can fit evolution and God together, why didn't God just use special creation? Isn't that better? And my answer is no. My answer that I come up with is no. There are instrumental goods that can only come about through the evolutionary process. What we mean for evil, God uses for good. And I think that's not just a story of Joseph, of Judas and Jesus, right? I think that's a story that is true throughout the history of life, long before humanity.
that's really interesting. So I have an article where I think about this too, and I give two possibilities and kind of let the reader decide not to give a false dichotomy, but just like, hey, here are two interesting ideas. One of them is an idea that Augustine had that runs through Aquinas, that the problem here in relation to animal death, during their time, animal death is not the fact that, let's say, the lion eats his prey. The problem is that we think that's a problem.
Yeah.
So Augustine, almost, I mean, Dr. Gavin Woodland has talked about this. Augustine almost glories and revels in the death of creatures, because to him, there was a beauty to creatures passing in and out of existence. For him, this was good. And he would use the Bible verse that, like, some of the Psalms, where we're told that God, one of the wondrous works that God does in creation is giving the lion its food.
Yes. Can
Right?
I touch on that for a second?
Yeah.
That's the call to creation psalm because it's a sort of poetic recounting of the creation account. What is interesting is, yeah, there is in the creation account itself, there is death. God gives the lion its food, but then it says God hides his face and the animals die essentially. And then it says God sends his spirit and he renews the face of the earth. That sinning of the spirit is alluding to Genesis 1.
Hmm.
So you nearly get an account of death and perhaps even extinction. Now, it's reading a bit into the account, I'll admit that. But you get an account of death and God renewing the earth through his spirit in the creation itself in that psalm. So, if we're going to have a biblical understanding of the creation account, outside of, Genesis, which kind of leaves it open, uh, this psalm that talks about it seems to talk about there being death for animals prior to Adam's sin. And this is just part of God's creation process.
Yeah, yeah. And so the one argument, and again, Aquinas has a similar thing too. Dr. Gavin Ortling, he gives this analogy where, like, if you walk into a machine shop and you cut yourself on one of the machinery, and then you go, "Oh, how evil is this machine?"
Right,
The machine's not the problem; you're the problem, right? Because
right.
you've done that. So, do you think that's a good, like, philosophical notion, that we're actually the ones who are misunderstanding this animal death, and that it's actually good, and there's even a beauty to diversification and passing in and out of existence, like the seasons changing almost?
Well, the answer is yes and no, right? I would still say it is inimical that creatures die. I would definitely say that death, ultimately the destruction of one of God's creatures, probably isn't good. Because it's non-being. Augustine, Augustine's account of evil is non-being. And death is sort of the epitome of non-being. The creature ceases to exist. So by Augustine's own logic, death has to be an evil. It has to be. And so
Mm,
I think in order to consistently even hold to Augustine's thoughts, doctrine of sin, his hamartiology, you have to believe that death is in some sense wrong. But I do agree with him that death can still be instrumentally good. And that's where I get into it's inimical to God's will, but it's also instrumental that God can create a higher good
Okay.
out of it. So yes, the answer is yes and no. I don't ever want to say, nearly callously that, a lion strangling an antelope is good. You know, it's good that the lion gets food, but obviously that's not good for the antelope. If we
Mhm.
could get the lion the food without the suffering of the antelope, that's a better world. And let's just admit that. That seems absolutely to follow. But nevertheless, I think we can give an account of why God allows this to happen and brings a greater world out of it.
Mm. And so to challenge you a little bit on that, it would seem let's say let me play devil's advocate as the
Sure. Go ahead.
non-believer here. It would it would seem that Christians are going to argue that the ends justify the means, and that
Yeah.
seems terrible. Like, because great atrocities
Mhm.
come out of using the good consequences that would follow from either a non-action or an evil action to
Mhm.
justify said non-action or evil action. And I'm at least I'm sympathetic to that because I'm not a consequentialist.
Right.
So I mean, do you find merit to that counterpoint, and how would you respond?
Yeah. First off, to deny consequentialism doesn't mean you never look at the consequences.
Mhm.
Because I am a virtue ethicist in the sense that I believe.
Hey,
Yeah,
let's
there
go.
you go. Yeah, I mean, so was C.S. Lewis, right?
Mhm,
That morality is less about act and more about who you are. You don't have to tell a good person. You don't have to give rules to a good person. They just naturally act good. And God is obviously goodness itself. He is the
mhm,
very definition of what it means to be good. So when God looks at consequences, it's because he wants and he wills the best for his creatures. He wants and wills the best for his creatures. And then he just acts out of that. And so obviously consequences are going to play some part of the logic of how God is going to create the world. And this is why I think this is that second element of theodicy that I think is super important, which is the fact that a, a good theodicy needs to say, why is evil inevitable? Why is evil inevitable? So there has to be, in some sense, that if God is going to create a good world, a great world, in fact, that in some sense it might necessitate creatures that go into workshops and hurt themselves. And that's just going to be part of an instrumental account for which God will take that and redeem that and make a better world from that. A world where Jesus died and rose again required Adam's sin. It required Judas's betrayal. It required the death of the one innocent person in history.
mm,
And yet we would say that's an incommensurable good, a good that far outweighs the evils that led to it.
interesting. So, I know I've actually thought about this, and, so I would be curious to know if you follow this line of thinking. So, Irenaeus was a church father, as
Mhm.
at least you and I know, and he has a really interesting argument about and thoughts on Genesis. But one of the things that he says is that it is impossible for God to create anything perfect because for him, perfection is an attribute that is only held by God himself.
Yeah.
And so to create perfection, so for God to create perfection would be for God to create God. Like that's how closely he ties.
And God's not created. Yeah.
Right, right. And so this is like a logically ridiculous, right? So he, because God can't do the logically impossible, he cannot create a perfect world. But what he can do, and what Irenaeus seems to argue, is that God can create a imperfect world that is destined for perfection,
Mhm.
that grows into perfection.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, are you sympathetic to that view? Would you use that idea as part of a apologetic, you might say,
Yeah,
for
I would develop it. I
the
think an Irenaean theodicy is definitely the route Christians should go. I think Irenaeus is a lot more helpful than traditional, somewhat Augustinian approaches. And the way I normally go is certain virtues, if you are a creature that possess virtues rather than are the virtues themselves. So God is love, but I have love.
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
Mhm.
But for God, God doesn't need to do anything to be loving. He just is the definition of what love is himself. So for me to be like God, to be loving, though, as a creature, it requires the act of love. It requires what Aristotle called habitus, a second nature. That God created our initial nature as innocent. Adam and Eve weren't perfect; they were innocent. They were like
Mhm.
babes with the capacity to grow and love and become more like God. That's more of an Eastern view, which takes from Irenaeus. Irenaeus, even though he's from Lyon, is typically considered more of an Eastern thinker. And I love that view because I think that's true. I think virtue, to be truly virtuous, means you grow into it. So, for instance, if I do a loving act and give $10,000 or go out and I serve the poor, let's just say I go out and I serve the poor. You think, wow, that was a really good act. But if there's a robot that's programmed to do it and does the exact same actions, we don't commend that robot the same way. Well, why not? It's because it's pre-programmed to do that. We don't think that there's any virtue in that. Virtue requires the freedom to not be virtuous. So for me to
Mm.
develop virtue, it requires me as a creature the capacity to not be virtuous. And so that allows for the possibility of evil. You have to have it if my virtue is truly to be virtuous. Otherwise, I am like the robot that goes out and serves. And there's no praise in that. God can't reward us for that. There's nothing worthwhile in that. So that's why I think it's a better world. A world that allows for the possibility of evil is a better world.
Gotcha. So, noting this, I actually have a question too that relates to this. So, your virtue ethical understanding, this view about growth, seems to fit well into your like understanding of a teleological evolution.
Yeah, 100% it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've outed me. Yes.
Yeah. So, but as far as I'm aware, evolutionists don't grant that evolution is teleological.
Yeah.
It seems that that they will say that this is precluded by the evidence of evolution.
Yeah, I mean
And
it's
so
go
I'm
ahead.
curious to know what your thoughts on that, because it seems like under your view you would kind of need both and in order to really ground this theodicy.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on which evolutionist you ask. 100%.
Mm,
I think that's a false narrative. In one of the chapters of my thesis, I actually outlined the fact that the architects of the modern synthesis of natural selection were by and large at least sympathetic towards teleology. So George Gaylord Simpson, Ernst Mayr came around to although the word he used for teleology is what is much more of a grandiose view, he was actually very sympathetic to Aristotle's view of teleology, which is what I'm arguing for.
mm,
Because that's also, again, I appeal to Aristotle's habitus, right, of virtue. And Ernst Mayr, again, one of the architects, the founders of the modern theory of evolution, was very sympathetic towards that. And I could keep going on and on. Like the idea that that's the statement that uh, evolution and teleology are at odds is horribly biased. There was actually an article against that came out in 1959 in response to the centennial of Darwin's publication, and George Gaylord Simpson came out and said, "No, evolution is teleological. It absolutely is." And then another founder called Theodosius Dobzhansky came out and argued against this, saying, no, there is a teleology in evolution. And somewhere along the line, those people have just been forgotten about. Like they themselves have not been, but their view has just been forgotten.
mm,
And this is what I try to out in my thesis is no, this has always been an implicit part of the theory of natural selection, particularly in the concept of fitness. And while it's never been really philosophically argued rigorously, biologists were aware of this. And even today, there's a guy named David Hankey. He was a biologist at Cambridge, he was a botanist. He said, we need to get rid of the theory of natural selection because it's too teleological. I challenge everyone listening to this go read his article. It's what is it called? It's like the explanation that bedevils. It's got the word bedevils in it. Biology, where he basically says we need to get rid of the concept of natural selection, the concept of fitness, because they are teleological, and science doesn't do that. Well, obviously it does.
mm. That is really interesting because you definitely get the narrative and the understanding that it's all random, right? It doesn't have a end goal,
Yeah,
and it just like creatures adapt to their environment, and then over time that for various reasons that creates new species. Uh, So
Well,
I guess
it's hidden.
I've never heard anyone defend the idea that it has some kind of purpose to it.
Well, it's hidden in there because what does it mean to say one creature is fitter than another? Well, you don't want to say, well, just it means it survives better because then you're saying survival of the fittest means the survivor of the survivors, which isn't an explanation.
Yeah, you're
So,
right.
what is it about fitness? Well, usually what you're saying is there are certain goods that creatures have. And as soon as you use the term good, you're speaking teleologically. Because good, to say something is good or bad is to make an assessment of a desire, a purpose, a goal. To say something has the ratio of a good, to have the logic of a good, means that it is desirable or a good or an end towards which one ought to strive. And fitness is unavoidably using these concepts of goods if it wants to be a true explanation of evolutionary accounts. Again, this is really brief. Your
Yeah.
probably audience is going to be scratching their heads, but that's what I defend. Look forward to the publication of that. They'll defend that better.
No, yeah, I'm definitely excited for that. So I if you have a couple more minutes, I
Sure.
could shoot some other questions. I have a little bit more time here. So I'm really interested in how evolution would affect our morality. So I've heard Christians say, like, of course, you want to ground objective morality in God. I've heard some other people say, well, you can't really do that because God is a mind, and by definition, objective would mean mind independent, like independent of the mind.
Yeah.
I've heard other people say that the best route to go for atheists philosophically is to ground it in evolution because it's an objective process that doesn't have a mind behind it, and so there is a objective morality that can arise from evolution, which
Yeah.
is, we need to survive, and then pro-social behavior can develop in order for people to survive and thrive, and then religion can develop on top of that, right? Because that religion can advocate for pro-social behavior. All of that said, though, do you have any thoughts on how evolution can relate to our understanding of morality?
Yeah, I mean, Darwin himself said, if we had evolved from more insect-like animals, we might have a much more hive mind mentality, which we consider very immoral.
Hmm.
So, using evolution, you can't derive an ought from an is. These attempts at evolutionary morality, where they try to jump from an ought to an is. I actually do think you can derive an ought from an is, but that's a different question. I don't think evolution can do that. You can't say this is the way we evolved. We evolved as, say, more peaceful apes. There is arguments like that. Michael Roos has recently published a book on this, and you can't then just say, okay, this is the way we evolved. Therefore, this ought to be goods for us because again, like what does my evolutionary past have? How can that ever impose something on me? My history shouldn't tell me what I ought to do. If I have a genetic
Mm,
predisposition to alcoholism, I have a history that explains why I do that, but it doesn't mean I ought to be an alcoholic. You can't
mm,
make this jump from this is the way we evolved. This is your historical explanations for why you are the way you are. Therefore, you ought to do that. Because then you get into some very dicey territory.
mm.
Now, as for the God, God cannot be the foundation of morality because, well,
Objective morality, at least.
yeah, objective. Excuse me, yeah, objective morality. Well, objective is sometimes defined as mind independent. I don't like that explanation because first off, it presupposes what we know, what we think that what mind is, which I don't think we do. Number two, there are objective facts that are not mind independent. Um, I am hungry. That is an objective. It might be an objective fact that I am hungry, but that is grounded in my mind. you know,
Mhm,
or my name is Seth Hart. That is an objective fact grounded in a sort of group mind, sort of that we have agreed as mental agents to call me Seth Hart. There are a lot of this idea of the objective versus subjective being divided by mind, I don't think works. What we normally mean when we say something objective is we mean that this is something that one ought to believe regardless of one's opinions upon the issue. That there's a sort of normativity to these facts. You ought to believe this in that sense. And that actually gets teleological. So there you go.
mm, gotcha. So, would you still want to have objective morality, and would you
Sure.
wanna ground it in God,
I
or
would.
do you take a different approach?
I would. I don't think there is a good account to concretely ground moral facts except in God. People will try to place them in sort of Platonic ideals. I don't think that works um, for a variety of reasons, both for ontological and epistemological reasons. I don't think that that makes sense.
Okay, gotcha. No, that's interesting. So, yeah, and I think I would actually agree with you to some extent. There were some people who engage in like gender studies and talk about the differences between the sexes, how we behave, comments on men and women issues, that sort of thing. They've talked about how there are studies that give a evolutionary reason why, let's say, men are stronger or something like that, right?
Yeah.
But like, and any other people have noted this, like those studies are descriptive, right?
Mhm.
They're not prescriptive. Like just because, like, assuming for the moment, for the sake of the argument, that men did evolve to be stronger, doesn't necessarily tell us that that's how it should be. That
Yeah.
men should be stronger than women,
Yeah.
right? Or something like that. And so, yeah, it's not just
You're jumping from an is to a not. It is the fact that men are on average stronger than women. Therefore, you ought to be stronger than your wife or something. That's a terrible logical jump.
yeah, 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 which I did find interesting. Um, to a different point though, one of the things I got asked, which I thought was really interesting, is that okay, let's just grant evolutionary creationism for the moment. Uh, aren't humans going to evolve and eventually, let's say thousands and thousands of years later,
Mhm.
we're going to look back and say, yeah, we're not Homo sapiens. We're actually something else now.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's gonna affect your doctrine of salvation. Some people are gonna say that's actually gonna disprove Christianity, right? Or stuff like that, because Christianity is supposed to have an eschatology, it's supposed to have an end
Yeah.
that relates to us. And
Mhm.
presumably by us, we mean Homo sapiens.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, C.S. Lewis actually addresses this in Mere Christianity.
Oh,
Yeah, and
interesting.
there's other author Pierre de Chardin. Um, it's spelled like Teilhard de Chardin, who also addresses this as well. Who's got some good stuff and some bad stuff. But basically, what we as Christians can do is to recognize there are levels to evolution. There was an it's I don't want to call this evolution, but there was a transformation from the original Big Bang to the formation of atoms, to the formation of stars, to the formation of galaxies, to the formation of solar systems, to the formation of prebiotic chemicals, to the formation of life, to the formation of humanity that can sit in relationship with God and unique, into the transformation of us into something else, something that is the same, that is human, but is also radically distinct in what we see in the resurrection of Christ. And C.S. Lewis himself says that is the next evolution of humanity. It is the final evolution of
Oh,
humanity. Yeah.
so
Mere Christianity.
that's that's an interesting way to think about it. So he takes like classical Christian eschatology, like we'll have imperishable glorified bodies, will be deified, right? Is the
Yeah.
language of much of church fathers in the Eastern Orthodox Church. We'll experience fully theosis.
Mhm.
So he takes that language and just says that's evolution.
Yes, essentially. And I mean, Callisto Swear, who was until recently one of the biggest Eastern Orthodox theologians in the West, he passed away recently.
Hmm.
And he, in his book, The Orthodox Way, when he talks about evolution, he says, this kind of fits into what Orthodox have been saying this whole time. Because they have theories of souls.
Really?
Yeah, theories of souls as well, that there's different sorts of souls that an animal has. I won't get into the details, but actually, I gave it a paper on this in front of scientists, and they loved it. So,
Oh,
yeah.
interesting. Were they
You,
all? I assume they weren't all believing scientists, right?
I would assume the majority of them were.
Okay,
So, yeah.
gotcha. No, that's really interesting. Okay, and one last question. You know, as far as I can tell, evolutionists have tried or can't explain the rise of consciousness and our souls, right? If there's an
Yeah.
immaterial part of ourselves that
Hmm.
can be detached from the body after death. Um, how how do those things fit in with evolutionary creationism? I know that the concept of ensoulment, right? The idea when does the soul into the body has been
Right.
a debate amongst Jews and Christians for a very long time.
Right.
So we're not the only ones having this discussion, but yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it depends on what you mean by soul, depends on your view of consciousness. And honestly, I don't think the theory of biological evolution has anything to say about this. It doesn't pose any problems, but it doesn't give any solutions either. because
Mm,
what it deals with is material origins. It does. And we know full well, because of the existence of angels, that you do not need a material body like us to have rational minds that think like us, because angels exist. So,
right. And
yeah,
they can think, talk, right, act. Yeah.
and do a lot of things that seem quite human, right? They seem to be
Yeah.
rational agents. So there's been a lot of explanations for that. And, some people are panpsychists and Christians as well, where they'll say, it's sort of consciousness evolves um, coincidentally with our material bodies. There's some who do think about ensoulment, that there was a particular sort of material substrate that God ensouled. That when we basically evolved to a certain point, God created a soul, and that was the image of God. So it solves that issue. There's a lot of different ideas that I can't even go through them all, because I do think that these, while they're interesting in conversation, they don't necessarily, create any new problems or provide any new solutions.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, this sounds like a kind of just like really big mystery. At least to me, as far as I
It
can
is.
tell, it's like we don't know why we have it, but we have it. So
I mean, and there are idealists. I mean, there are idealists who think there is no such thing as evolution outside of mind, because everything is mind. So this is no
oh,
problem at all.
that's a take.
Yeah, interesting one. I mean, you
Yeah.
get people like Joshua Rasmussen, who is a Christian idealist. So yeah.
Oh, interesting. Does he I get real quick since we're on that, what is a Christian idealist? Is he like gonna think everything is existing in God's mind, or am I just completely
Well,
misrepresenting?
fundamentally, idealism just says that the fundamental nature of reality is mental, and you know it actually, if you really begin to think about it, it becomes quite difficult, because that's not saying that there is no such thing as matter. It's just redefining what we mean by matter. It's meaning that when I say this is a material object, I just mean it's some sort of mental property that exists out here that we can all see with our senses and stuff like that and interpret. So it gets really tough sometimes even to differentiate these opinions. But to be a Christian idealist is just to say that in some sense that the nature of the world is mind. Now, some people will say that it is God's mind. That's Berkeley's idea, George Berkeley, who kind of is the original Christian idealist,
Mm.
at least in the modern period. Uh, Other people will say that maybe it's not God's mind. Maybe there's a world soul, so to speak, that the world itself is one soul that we exist within. That sounds trippy, but there are
Yeah.
Christians who thought that. I mean, that's
Yeah.
how I'm currently reading Sergius Bulgakov, who's an Eastern Orthodox thinker, kind of a maverick one. That seems to be the way he interprets the world. So,
Interesting.
yeah, so you've got a variety to pick from, so to speak. And there are some idealists who don't believe in God. So there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely, yeah, that all of that gets over my head. I love philosophy, but there was a point where I'm just like, I'm done. I'm checked
Fair.
out. Yeah. Um, Thank you so much, Dr. Hart, for
Appreciate it. Been
for
great.
coming on. Like I said, I've been following, Spiritually Incorrect podcast and you guys for a while. And when you accepted my friend request, I was like, holy crap, another evolutionary creationist just followed me. Because honestly, like, you know, all like joking and everything aside, it feels, regardless of the statistics, it feels very lonely in some ways, theologically speaking, to be an evolutionary
Yeah.
creationist. Because whatever the statistics are, young Earth creationism is the culturally popular idea amongst Christians and non-Christians, and it's loud. You know,
Mhm.
so it is nice to also meet someone who came to similar
Sure.
conclusions and stuff like that. So
Always good. And I would
yeah,
say that that is very true in church settings, but in academic settings, it's nearly the reverse.
really.
Yeah, that most Christian academics are very, very much at peace with evolution for a lot of the reasons I've said today and for others.
Gotcha. No, that is interesting to note. Hopefully, the academic stuff makes it down to the popular
That's
level.
always the hope, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for joining me for this, guys. Make sure to comment, like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Like I said, I got the two videos that I'm at least writing scripts for this month. I don't know if they'll come out. Another one, I am so sorry, I forgot to mention. I will be doing a video with a ex fundamentalist. So she grew up in a fundamentalist culture and things like that, and I'm going to be talking to her about her experience in that. So look for that to come up at the end of this month. But otherwise, again, Seth, thank you so much for joining me for this. Do you have any final comments or anything you'd like to say before we head out?
Can I answer one question real quick that we just got?
Sure.
Yeah, Rachel asks, it might be overthinking it, but it almost sounds
Oh,
Hindu. By that, she means probably Advaita Vedanta. Advaita
mm,
Vedanta is, I mean, there are idealists who are kind of lean in that direction. So Bernardo Kastrup would be a philosopher who is kind of what you call Hindu, but it's a very particular branch of Hinduism called Advaita Vedanta, which is pantheistic. Um, but there are others who are not. So I do want to stress that if you are an idealist, you've got some good company. You don't need to be pantheist. You don't need to sound Hindu by that. And so yeah. But as final thoughts, thank you so much for having me. This was great. I really appreciate all the comments coming in, and maybe we could do it again, Izzy.